Hey guys, before we start, a quick shout out to Alpha Dog Nutrition for sponsoring this podcast. Alpha Dog products are now available at dusupply.com, and you can use code ALPHADOG15 at checkout for 15% off and a credit for free shipping to try it yourself. Now let's get you to your podcast.
Find yourself in the pages of Full Cry as we dive into the archives of America's leading tree dog publication. Join us as we look back at decades of stories, articles, and more written by those bold enough to follow the echoes of a hound.
On North Fork River by Johnny Wilson from Pottersville, Missouri. From the April 1960 issue of Full Cry magazine. This hunt that I enjoyed so much took place around the last of deer season. I had asked several of my coon hunting buddies to go with me on this planned hunting trip, but it seemed that everybody was deer hunting. My hunting buddies had their last day to get that deer and didn't want to be out late, so I had to go hunting by myself. This kind of made it rough on me because I had to handle the dogs, the gun, the flashlight, and worst of all, carry all the coon. Anyway, I rushed on home from work, ate a big supper, got the dogs in the car, and finally took off. I had to drive about 24 miles to get to my favorite hunting grounds. Where I was going to hunt, the river was fairly wide and plenty of green briars, and the hills were very steep and plenty of bluffs. I finally came off the river hill down into Clarence Gunter's yard. The lights came on, and Clarence came out. He seemed to be tickled for me to come down and hunt. He told me of the coon getting into his chicken house and catching 9 of his chickens. He also told me about setting a steel trap which caught the coon. The coon weighed close to 25 pounds. Clarence lives in a beautiful place. The hills knock the wind off from the west, north, and south. On the east runs the river. The river runs south, and the big spring runs into the river about a quarter below his house. It is full of big rainbow trout, but you can't fish. It's private. He has a big yard full of shade trees, and on his little white house is a large deer head mounted. His yard is green the year round. This is one of the many beautiful places in the Ozarks. Now, I will tell you about my dogs. I have just 2 dogs. One, a registered English hound, which I call Spot. He has a red head, red legs, and a blue spotted body. He was 9 years old on March 5th. He treated his first coon when he was 7 months old, and the biggest one I ever caught. I also took him with me when I went fishing on the river. He was young then and cold-tracked the coon along the river. I've seen him several times swim the river while I was fishing, and he was just a young dog. He would trail up to where the coon crossed the river, but to his surprise, the trail would never leave the river. Because of this, dampness would keep the trail fresh along the river all day. Away from the river, it would vanish. This old dog has run nothing but coon ever since I completely broke him at 5 years old. Now the other dog is a half Plott and half English, my old hound's pup. She would make a good coon dog if she were broke just a little more off of deer. But, worst of all, I can't get her to swim the river. So much for my dogs. I'll get on with the story. I finally got my dogs out and was on my way down toward the spring when Lady struck away along the side of a hill on the right of the spring. She was climbing the hill when my old dog struck away down on the left of the spring. I couldn't hear too well for the while on account of the water making such a roar. Lady left the coon and started to my old dog. Old Spot ran his coon across the river into the bluffs. While Lady was trying to get across the big spring to him, she ran into face to face a big coon and treed along the big spring. I soon spotted the coon, but the bank was so steep I couldn't get a good shot as the coon was on the other side. I shot him in the back, and down he came and right into the water, and then under the bank. The dogs had already struck 3 coon. This was pretty sorry hunting. By the time the coon got under the bank, my old dog was swimming across the spring. I got the dogs away from the spring and started down the river when my old dog struck way down on the river with that lonesome ball. Lady put in. They weren't trailing too fast. When I got down away, I could see why. Big sycamores and elms were cut down every direction into the water. My old dog finally quit barking and striking further down as he went. He got so close to the coon that way, it left the water and got into the flat. Lady went one way, and Spot went the other. At the same instant, Lady treed, and Spot treed. Lady was treed up a walnut tree, and there sat a coon. Spot was treed right beside the river. I shot Lady's coon. My old dog heard the shot, but wouldn't pull. I quickly went to his tree. He was treed up a small sapling. The coon was about 10 feet off the ground, and he could see him and was going wild. If I missed the coon, he would get into the water and give some trouble because the water was very swift. I took aim and killed him with the first shot. The dogs chewed on him for a while. Old Spot left up the river and struck again in the cut trees. The dog trailed several hundred yards up the river. He bayed one time, then I realized the coon had crossed the river. I didn't want him to swim the river because it was very cold. I started to call him back, but about that time he was barking on the other side. Lady was wanting across but wouldn't go. She just bayed. The coon went up the river about a half mile and crossed on my side. Then Lady put in. They left the river, across a big cornfield, and then up the big hill. By that time, they were really running. Just before they got to the top, they treed hard. I climbed the steep hill and shined my light on the tree. Way up at the top sat a big coon, and I got to looking middle ways up the tree, and there was a coon tail sticking out of a hole. I shot the one on the top, and the other one bailed out. The same time he hit the ground, the dogs were on him, and the fight was on. As the hill was steep, the dogs and the coon fought all the way to the bottom. When I got to the bottom of the hill, they had him stretched out. I lugged those 2 coon down to the riverbank where I had left the other 2. Now I had 4 coon, a gun, and about a half mile from the car. Since I had come prepared, I got my heavy string out of my pocket. I tied a knot to one front foot and one back foot of each coon. Only the first 2 coon to go on my back were tied shorter than the last 2. I threw one over my left shoulder and then one over my right shoulder. The other 2 went on the same way, except they had a longer lead. I straightened up with the 4 coon on my back and started back toward the car. The dogs went out of sight of the light again. I listened to hear one bark again any second. I finally got back to where the little bridge crossed the spring onto the road that went to Clarence's house between the river and the spring. Finally, I heard a lady hit on top of the hill on the other side of the spring. I realized this was the first track she had started some hours ago. My old dog struck along the spring, but it was very cold. Lady kept trailing and barking. The only trouble was my older dog couldn't hear her as he was right at the foot of the hill. I took the coon off my back, and what a relief, as the stringers were cutting into my neck. I sat down and listened. Lady began to run faster and was barking more on track. She finally left to the west, out of hearing. One thing stuck in my mind, and that was deer. She was pretty bad after deer at this time. I sat for about 10 minutes and not a sound. Then I heard her coming back from the west. By this time, she was really running. Now I was sure it was a deer. Just as she almost got back to where she struck on top, she turned and went right up the ridge to the north toward the house, only above it on the hill. I knew if it was a coon or a bobcat, it wouldn't take long because there were bluffs on every corner. She went on by the bluffs and out of hearing. By this time, old Spot came back off the bad track he had struck. I heard Lady pulling the hill out of the hollow, and she was running hard. If I'd been up there, I would have beaten her with a club. By this time, Old Faithful could hear her running, so he took off to check her. Lady was on top of the hill, then all at once she hushed and marked a tree. I thought, surely not treed. She was supposed to be running a deer. She barked treed. By this time, my old dog was up there and treeing with her. I was really surprised. I went up to the car and left the coons. Then I began climbing the hill. When I got to the top, I shined my light and could see it wasn't a den tree. I spotted him about halfway up. I was looking down the sights of my .22 when I pulled the trigger. He came out of the red oak and hit the ground. I soon got back to the car and let another coon off. I caught my dogs and went out to the front of Clarence's house where he had a long river boat tied to a tree. I loaded my dogs and equipment into the boat, got that long gig, and was on my way. When I got to the other side, I got started towards another cornfield just when my old dog struck on the other side of the field at the foot of the hill. Lady put in. When they got on the top of the hill, Spot treed hard, then Lady treed. When I reached them, where the tree was, I was out of wind. They were treed on a dead snag, a real den tree. I caught the dogs and started back down the hill. I was almost back to the boat when old Spot struck again. He was on the river. He soon warmed the coon up, but it went straight to the bluff. I caught the dogs, went back across the river to the car. I loaded the dogs and was soon pulling the hill toward home. It wasn't long before I was on the Blair Bridge that crossed North Fork. I thought I would stop off and hunt up the river a way. It was getting late and cold and frosty. I let the dogs out. They disappeared into the darkness, and fog was coming off the river, and the river had a deep, fresh smell. All at once, I heard Spot bawl way up the river. I could tell he hit pretty cold track because of the long bawl. I soon caught up. He was trailing through the thicket of briars, and the frost was glittering. Then I heard Lady farther up the river. She had hit a warm track. My old dog broke to go with her. She turned and headed towards us, as there wasn't over 100 yards between the river bank and the bluff on the flat. My old hound ran right into the coon. He treed hard. When I got there, he was treed up against the big bluff. The coon just almost made it, but not quite. By this time, Lady came into the tree. I shined my light up the tree, and there sat a coon toward the top. Every way I looked at the coon, it looked white. I thought, now I have finally treed an albino coon. I got my sights on the small-looking coon and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit dead center, but the coon didn't fall out. Instead, the coon started coming down in a slow run. I thought, now this is only a kitten, and I would let Lady fight it. I wanted to see how good she could kill one by herself. I caught Spot. The coon was better than halfway down, and it was almost to the bottom when I saw it wasn't a little coon at all. Lady was waiting at the butt of the tree. The coon saw her and leapt out on a grapevine and then to the ground. She bailed on the coon, but couldn't even stop it. I turned Spot loose. The coon almost made it before they killed it. I sure hated to see my old dog get torn up, as he's had a hold of too many in the last 9 years. I finally got the big boar away from the dogs and started back to the car. When I arrived back home, I slipped in and looked at the clock on my way to bed. It was 4:30. I crawled into bed, completely worn out, rolled over into a deep sleep with just another memory of one of my many coon hunts.
Like what you heard? Leave us a review and make sure to tag @FullCrimeMag when sharing your own adventures. You can check out more vintage content and get your subscription to the all-new Full Cry magazine at www.fullcrymag.com. From the pages of Full Cry is a Full Cry production. We want to thank our sponsors and encourage everyone to support those who support our lifestyle. This episode would not be possible without the support of Next Level Super Premium Dog Food and W Hunting Supply. Until next time, keep those dogs in the woods and find yourself in the pages of Full Cry.